66 years on the throne, over 100 children, and a face carved so deeply into stone that 3,000 years of desert wind could not erase it. When Ramesses II died around 1213 before Christ, he was approximately 90 years old, crippled by arthritis, his jaw riddled with abscesses, his spine curving under the weight of a body that had simply refused to stop. He had outlived 12 of his own crown princes. He had outlived his enemies, his wives, his rivals, and very nearly his own empire. And yet, when archaeologists pulled his linen-wrapped body from a hidden cache of royal mummies in 1881, his arms were still crossed in the posture of a god. How does a man born into a military family that seized power barely a generation earlier become the most enduring symbol of pharaonic civilization itself? How does a young commander, who nearly lost everything in a single afternoon at Kadesh, transform that disaster into the greatest propaganda triumph the ancient world had ever seen? And what did it cost him, across those decades of glory and slow decline, to become not just a king but a living deity? This is the complete story, not a summary, not a collection of famous moments. This is the full arc of an extraordinary life, told from the beginning. We will start before Ramesses was born, in an Egypt still reeling from the chaos of Akhenaten's religious revolution, where generals and viziers clawed their way to the throne and a new dynasty was forged from ambition and military discipline. We will follow the boy prince as he learns war and scripture in the palaces of Memphis, rides his first chariot into Nubia beside his father Seti, and accepts the double crown at roughly 24 years of age. We will stand with him on the plains beside the Orontes River, where 2,500 Hittite chariots shattered his army, and only his own reckless courage kept him alive. We will watch him turn that near catastrophe into carved stone and painted verse, then negotiate history's first known peace treaty with the very empire that almost destroyed him. We will walk through the temples he raised at Abu Simbel, through the glittering capital of Pi-Ramesses, through the painted chambers of Nefertari's tomb, where color still breathes on the walls after 32 centuries. And we will sit with him in his final years, an old man surrounded by ghosts, burying son after son, performing rituals with hands that could barely grip the crook and flail, watching the borders of his empire quietly contract, while the world he built began its long transformation into legend. This is a man whose name the Greeks reshaped into Ozymandias, whose reign may echo behind the Exodus narrative, whose mummy was issued a modern passport to fly to Paris for conservation. His monuments were so massive that an international coalition spent 4 years cutting Abu Simbel from a cliff face and reassembling it above the rising waters of a new lake. Shelley wrote a poem about his fallen colossus and called it a meditation on the vanity of power. But the irony is that Ramesses won. His name did not vanish, his face did not crumble. He built eternity, and eternity held. The truth behind that achievement is more complex, more human, and more astonishing than any myth. We will separate what the inscriptions prove from what tradition invented, what his body reveals from what his temples proclaim, and what it meant to be both a man and a god in a world where the two were never supposed to be the same thing. If you are drawn to complete journeys through the lives that shaped civilization, subscribe and stay close. Each week we bring back one immortal name and reveal the real human being who carried it. Now let us begin, not with the God King, but with the world that made him, a world of shattered temples and rising generals, where a dynasty was born from nothing and a child was forged for a throne he would hold longer than any pharaoh in memory. The desert wind moves through empty halls, sand drifts across painted floors where no priest walks, no incense burns, no hymn rises to the ceiling. The city of Akhetaten stands abandoned on the east bank of the Nile, its mud-brick walls already crumbling, its grand boulevards given over to silence. A king once built this place to honor a single god, the Aten, the sun disk, and in doing so, he nearly destroyed Egypt itself. Akhenaten's revolution had lasted barely 17 years. He had closed the temples of Amun, scattered the priesthoods, moved the capital from Thebes to this desolate plain in Middle Egypt, and declared that he alone could intercede with the divine. When he died, around 1326 before the Common Era, he left behind a kingdom fractured at its foundations. The empire's vassals in Syria and Canaan sent desperate letters begging for military aid that never came. The treasury was strained. The old gods were silent in their sealed sanctuaries. His successors scrambled to undo the damage. The boy king Tutankhamun, barely 10 years old at his accession, restored the cult of Amun and returned the court to Thebes and Memphis. His famous restoration stela describes temples fallen to ruin, their shrines overgrown, the gods turning their backs on Egypt. Yet Tutankhamun died young, around 1305 before the Common Era, without an heir. The general Ai ruled briefly after him. Then came Horemheb. Horemheb was no royal son. He was a military commander from Heracleopolis, a man who had risen through discipline and administrative brilliance. He seized the throne, erased Akhenaten's name from every monument he could find, dismantled the Aten temples at Karnak, and used their stone blocks as fill inside his own pylons. He reformed the courts, reorganized the army, punished corrupt officials, and restored order with an iron hand. His reign of perhaps 14 years rebuilt the machinery of the Egyptian state. But Horemheb, too, died without a living heir. On his deathbed, or perhaps shortly before, Horemheb chose his successor, not from any royal bloodline, but from the ranks of the military. A vizier and general named Pi-Ramesses, already elderly, already grey, a man from the eastern delta town of Avaris, with no claim to divinity, except the trust of a dying king. Pi-Ramesses became Ramesses I, founding a dynasty that would reshape the ancient world. His reign lasted barely 2 years. The old soldier had time to begin a chapel at Abydos and a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings before death claimed him around 1294 before the Common Era. But his purpose had been fulfilled. He had placed his son on the path to the throne. That son was Seti. Where his father had been a transitional figure, Seti I was a pharaoh of ambition and vision. He marched north into Canaan in his first year, reclaiming fortresses, reasserting Egyptian authority over trade routes that had slipped away during the Amarna chaos. His war reliefs at Karnak showed disciplined columns of infantry and chariotry sweeping through the Levant, storming fortified towns, driving Shasu Bedouin from the frontier. He pushed as far as Kadesh on the Orontes, briefly recapturing territory that bordered the expanding Hittite Empire. At home, Seti built with exquisite taste. His temple at Abydos remains among the most beautiful in Egypt, its raised relief carving so fine it seems to breathe in torchlight. He restored monuments, reopened quarries, and filled the temples of Amun with offerings. The heresy was being buried, stone by stone. In the military camps of the Delta, in the palace workshops of Memphis, a new Egypt was taking shape, harder, more martial, defined by the officer class that now held power. And somewhere in this world, around 1303 before the Common Era, a child was born into the royal household. He was the second son of Seti and Queen Tuya, a boy who would inherit everything his grandfather had seized and his father had rebuilt. His elder brother would die young, leaving him alone in the path of destiny. He would be given command of soldiers before he could grow a beard. He would be crowned before the gods while his father still lived. And he would reign longer than any pharaoh in memory until his name became synonymous with Egypt itself. But all of that lay ahead, beyond the horizon, where the Nile meets the morning sun. The boy was born into stone and sunlight. The palace at Memphis stood where the delta began to fan outward, where the Nile split into its many fingers reaching for the sea. Here, in mud-brick chambers plastered white and painted with lotus friezes, the child who would become the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian memory drew his first breath. His mother Tuya was no minor consort. She held the title of great royal wife and came from a military family herself, her father a lieutenant of chariots. His father Seti was already a man of war, lean and purposeful, a king who understood that Egypt's greatness had to be earned back campaign by campaign, temple by temple, inscription by inscription. The boy had an elder brother. The sources preserve almost nothing of him, not even a certain name, though some scholars suggest Neb-Chassetnebet. What is known is that this brother died young, perhaps before his 10th year, and that his death rearranged the architecture of an empire. Ramesses, the second son, stepped into the vacancy. He was perhaps 10 years old when the full weight of dynastic expectation settled onto his narrow shoulders. His education began in the scribal schools attached to the Temple of Ptah at Memphis. Young princes sat cross-legged on reed mats, grinding pigment into ink, learning to shape hieratic script on limestone flakes, the ostraca that survive by the thousands in Egyptian soil. They copied wisdom texts, administrative formulas, hymns to the gods. Literacy was power in Egypt, and a future king needed to read dispatches, understand grain tallies, and compose prayers that would be carved into eternity. But the reed pen was only half the curriculum. The other half was war. In the chariot yards north of Memphis, the prince learned to stand balanced in a lightweight vehicle of bent wood and leather, drawn by 2 horses at full gallop. He learned the composite bow, layers of horn, wood, and sinew, glued and bent into a weapon that could drive an arrow through bronze-scale armor at 80 paces. He learned the khopesh, the curved sickle sword of Egyptian infantry, and the mace that symbolized royal authority since the days of Nama. Seti was deliberate in this. He had watched the Amarna collapse destroy a dynasty that forgot the battlefield. His son would not forget. By his early teens, Ramesses already bore the title Commander of the Army, not merely ceremonial, though its practical scope at that age was limited. He appeared in court alongside his father, depicted on temple walls at a scale that announced his status to every literate official in the kingdom. At Karnak, Seti's war reliefs show the campaigns into Canaan and Syria, the storming of fortified towns, the presentation of captives before Amun-Ra. The young prince witnessed these triumphs, absorbed their lessons, and understood the message his father was carving into sandstone, that pharaoh's legitimacy flowed from victory. Seti also taught by building. The great temple at Abydos, with its exquisite raised relief and its famous king list linking the 19th dynasty back through every legitimate pharaoh to Menes, was Seti's masterwork of theological politics. It erased Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I from the record entirely. The boy who walked those halls learned that history was not merely what happened, it was what Pharaoh chose to remember. Around 1289 before the Common Era, Seti took the extraordinary step of naming Ramesses co-regent. The prince was perhaps 14. He was given his own household, his own estates, his own harem. He married young Nefertari and Isetnofret. Both appear to have entered his life during these years, though the exact dates remain uncertain. He was already fathering children before he ruled alone. The co-regency gave him administrative experience, ceremonial authority, and something rarer, time to watch a competent king govern, to learn the rhythms of taxation, temple endowment, military logistics, and diplomatic correspondence with foreign courts. The clay tablets of the age reveal a world of constant negotiation with Hittite kings, Babylonian rulers, Assyrian ambassadors, and restive Canaanite vassals. The young co-regent saw his father manage all of it, balancing threat and gift, war and treaty. These were the years that forged not just a soldier, but a statesman. When Seti's health began to fail, the machinery of succession was already in motion, oiled and tested. The prince who had once been a second son, never meant for the double crown, stood ready to claim it. The South called him before the throne did. Somewhere around his 14th year, the prince who had learned war in theory was sent to practice it in dust and heat, along the upper Nile, where Egypt's authority thinned against the granite hills of Nubia. The reliefs at Beit el-Wali, carved into a cliff face near the first cataract, preserve the earliest image of Ramesses in combat. A young man on a charging chariot, bow drawn, his body lean and coiled, driving into a chaos of Nubian warriors. The scene is formulaic in its composition, following conventions older than the pyramids, yet the specificity of the setting and the prince's prominence suggest something real beneath the propaganda. He was there, he fought, and he was meant to be seen fighting. Nubia in this era was not wilderness. Egyptian fortresses lined the river south of Aswan, massive mud-brick structures with crenellated walls and narrow gates, their granaries stocked against siege, their garrisons rotated on schedules dictated from Memphis. The gold mines of Wawat and Kush fed the Egyptian treasury, and any disruption to that flow demanded swift response. Seti had campaigned here, and now his son rode beside him or ahead of him, learning the particular cruelty of desert warfare. The blinding light off sand, the scarcity of water between wells, the speed required to strike semi-nomadic raiders who melted into the wadis after ambush. The Libyan frontier demanded attention as well. To the west, beyond the delta's cultivated edge, Meshwesh and Libu tribesmen pressed against Egyptian borders, raiding settlements, testing defenses. The young prince appears in records associated with these western operations, though the details remain sparse. What survives is the pattern. Seti was systematically exposing his heir to every theater of Egyptian military concern, building not merely a warrior, but a commander who understood the empire's full geographic vulnerability. It was during these years that Ramesses established his first household. Nefertari appears in the record, already bearing the title of royal wife, her origins debated by scholars, but her importance beyond question. Isetanofret, the second great wife, likely entered his life in this same period. Children began to arrive. Amun-her-hepeshef, his firstborn son, and others whose names would eventually fill entire walls of temple corridors. The prince was building a dynasty within a dynasty, his personal court expanding even as his father still reigned. The co-regency itself remains one of Egyptology's persistent debates. Some scholars place its beginning as early as Ramesses' 10th year of life, others closer to his 20th. The evidence, a stela from the turquoise mines of Sinai, administrative documents bearing both names in royal cartouches, the Abydos king list's careful arrangement, points to a gradual transfer rather than a single ceremonial moment. Seti was pragmatic. He had watched the chaos that followed uncertain successions, the brief reigns and palace conspiracies that had plagued the late 18th dynasty. He would not leave the throne to chance. As the 1270s before the Common Era wore on, Seti's vigor diminished. His mummy, discovered centuries later, reveals a man who suffered cardiovascular disease, his aorta calcified, his body worn by decades of campaigning. The prince took on more, overseeing construction at Abydos, managing diplomatic correspondence, reviewing military readiness along the Syrian frontier where Hittite power was growing. The world beyond Egypt's borders was shifting. Muwatalli, the young Hittite king, was consolidating his own authority, drawing vassal states into his orbit, and the contested territories of Amurru and Kadesh were drifting toward Hatti's influence. Ramesses watched. He trained. He fathered children and commanded soldiers and learned the weight of administrative papyrus stacked on a vizier's desk. And when Seti finally died, around 1279 before the Common Era, the transition was seamless, not because death was expected, but because every contingency had been rehearsed. The prince stepped forward into sole kingship as naturally as the Nile rose in flood season. He was approximately 24 years old, already a father many times over, already a veteran of frontier warfare, already intimate with the machinery of empire. The double crown settled onto a head that had been shaped for it since birth. But first, the dead king required his eternity. Seti's body lay in the hands of the embalmers for 70 days while the kingdom held its breath. Organs drawn through linen-wrapped fingers, natron salt drawing moisture from flesh that had commanded armies, resin poured dark and fragrant into the cavity where a warrior's heart had beaten. The funeral procession crossed the Nile at Thebes under a white sky, the golden coffin borne on a sledge dragged by oxen and priests, mourners casting dust upon their heads, the wailing of women rising and falling like wind across papyrus reeds. Into the Valley of the Kings they carried him, into Tomb Kefeft 17, where painted walls depicted the journey through the underworld with a precision and beauty that would not be surpassed for generations. The sarcophagus of translucent alabaster swallowed the light of the last torches. Then the tomb was sealed, and Seti belonged to Osiris. Ramesses belonged to Egypt. The coronation rituals unfolded across days of ceremony at Thebes and Memphis, the purification in sacred water, the anointing with oils, the placement of the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of the Delta, unified into the double crown that signified dominion over the two lands. He took the full fivefold titulary: Horus name, two ladies' name, golden Horus name, throne name, user matre setepenre, powerful is the justice of Ra, chosen of Ra, and birth name Ramesses Meriamun, Ramesses beloved of Amun. These names were carved immediately into stone at Thebes, at Memphis, at Heliopolis. They announced not merely a new king, but a theological statement. This pharaoh was the instrument of cosmic order itself. His first acts as sole ruler revealed a mind already thinking in centuries. He dispatched workers to Abydos to complete his father's magnificent temple, ensuring Seti's mortuary cult would function in perpetuity. But alongside filial piety ran raw ambition. At Abydos he began his own temple nearby, and in the eastern delta he accelerated construction of the project that would define his domestic legacy. The new capital, Pi-Ramesses, the House of Ramesses, rising on the site near ancient Avaris where his family had its roots. Mud brick walls climbed from the flat delta earth. Faience tiles in turquoise and cobalt were pressed into facades. Workshops for bronze casting, chariot assembly, and weapons manufacture spread across what would become 18 square kilometers of urban sprawl. Canals were dug to connect the city to the Nile's Pelusiac branch. Granaries filled. Barracks multiplied. This was not vanity alone. Pi-Ramesses sat at the strategic hinge between Egypt and Asia, closer to the contested Levantine territories than distant Thebes could ever be. From here, armies could mobilize northward within days. Diplomatic couriers arrived faster. The king could watch the horizon from which threats came. And threats were real. The Hittite Empire under Muwatalli II pressed steadily southward. The vassal kingdom of Amurru, which Seti had briefly reclaimed, wavered in its loyalty. Kadesh on the Orontes remained a Hittite stronghold, a fortress city that blocked Egyptian ambitions in Syria like a stone in the throat. Diplomatic tablets, clay pressed with cuneiform, carried by envoys across hundreds of kilometers, passed between courts with increasing tension. Ramesses read the intelligence. He understood that his father's campaigns had stabilized, but not resolved the northern question. In these earliest regnal years, he strengthened garrisons along the ways of Horus, the fortified road across northern Sinai. He reviewed chariot divisions. He appointed loyal men to governorships in Canaan. Inscriptions from his first years, record offerings to the gods at every major temple, Amun at Karnak, Ptah at Memphis, Ra-Horakhti at Heliopolis, binding the priesthoods to his reign through generosity and presence. The young pharaoh moved between his cities with the restless energy that would characterize 6 decades of rule. He was establishing not just authority but identity, carving his cartouche deeper and larger than any predecessor, commissioning statues that bore his idealized features with a confidence bordering on defiance. Every inscription declared permanence. Every foundation stone promised eternity. He was 24, 25, 26, and already the kingdom bore his name on every horizon. But to the north, beyond the cedar forests of Lebanon, the Hittite king was also building alliances, building armies, and waiting. The waiting ended in his 4th year of sole rule. The Hittite king Muwatalli II had drawn the kingdom of Amurru back into his orbit. That narrow strip of coastal territory wedged between the Lebanon mountains and the sea, a land whose loyalty shifted with the prevailing wind. Amurru had sworn allegiance to Egypt under Seti. Now its prince Benteshina bent his knee toward Hattusa instead, and with that single act of defection, the entire Egyptian position in Syria began to unravel. Ramesses understood what his father had understood before him. Whoever held Amurru controlled the coastal road north. Whoever controlled the road controlled the trade. And whoever held the fortress city of Kadesh, perched on the Orontes River, where the inland route turned east toward Mesopotamia, held the key to everything. The mobilization began at Pi-Ramesses. The new capital in the eastern delta had been designed for precisely this purpose, not merely a residence but a staging ground, its armories stocked with bronze-tipped arrows by the tens of thousands, its chariot workshops turning out lightweight vehicles of bent wood and leather, their axles greased, their wheels six-spoked for speed. The army that assembled there in the spring of year 5 was the largest Egypt had fielded in living memory. 4 divisions, each numbering roughly 5,000 men, bore the names of the gods themselves: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Infantry marched in columns with copper-bladed spears and ox-hide shields. Charioteers checked their composite bows, weapons of laminated horn and sinew that could drive an arrow through scale armor at 100 paces. Alongside the regulars marched Sheridan mercenaries, former sea raiders captured and pressed into Pharaoh's service, their horned helmets and round shields distinctive in the ranks. The army crossed the Sinai along the coastal road, the ancient ways of Horus, past fortified wells and supply depots spaced a day's march apart. Through Gaza and up the Canaanite coast they moved, a column stretching for miles, raising a plume of dust visible from the hilltops. Ramesses rode at the head of the Amun division, the blue war crown on his brow, his personal lion reportedly trotting beside the royal chariot. The march took roughly 4 weeks. Past Byblos, past the Dog River where pharaohs before him had carved their victories into the cliff face, and then inland, turning east toward the Bekaa Valley and the upper Orontes. Intelligence arrived in fragments. Egyptian scouts reported the countryside quiet, the Hittite army nowhere in evidence. Then, near the fording point south of Kadesh, 2 Bedouin wanderers were brought before the king. They claimed to be deserters from Muwatalli's forces. They said the Hittite army was far to the north, near Aleppo, too frightened to march south. It was exactly what Ramesses wanted to hear. He pressed forward with the Amun division, crossing the Orontes and establishing camp on the plain northwest of Kadesh. The Ra division followed some miles behind. Ptah and Seth trailed further still, strung out along the road like beads on a fraying thread. What Ramesses did not know, what the Bedouin had been carefully instructed to conceal, was that Muwatalli's entire army lay hidden behind the city of Kadesh itself. Not at Aleppo, not retreating, waiting. The Hittite king had assembled a coalition of staggering scale, soldiers and chariots drawn from across Anatolia and northern Syria, vassal kingdoms contributing their finest warriors. Ancient sources claim nearly 40,000 men and 2,500 chariots massed behind the Tell of Kadesh, screened by the city's bulk, invisible to Egyptian scouts approaching from the south. The trap was set with patient precision. As Ramesses' camp took shape on the open plain, as tent poles rose and horses were unhitched, the greatest ambush in Bronze Age warfare coiled like a spring on the far side of the river. The young pharaoh sat in his field tent, confident in false intelligence, his army divided across miles of road. He was 29 years old, commanding the mightiest force Egypt could muster, and he had walked directly into the jaws of annihilation. The truth arrived before the blow. 2 Hittite scouts, dragged into the Egyptian camp and beaten until they spoke, finally revealed what the Bedouin informants had concealed. Muwatalli's army was not far to the north. It was here, massed behind the city of Kadesh, barely 2 miles from where Ramesses sat. The Amun division had made camp alone. The Ra division was still marching up from the south, strung out along the road in column, vulnerable. The Ptah and Seth divisions trailed further still, hours away. The Egyptian army, 20,000 strong, had been split into 4 pieces by its own confidence, and the Hittite king held a blade against the seam. There was no time to reunite. The Hittite chariots struck the Ra division first, fording the Orontes south of Kadesh and smashing into the marching column from the flank. 2,500 chariots, each carrying 3 men, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a warrior armed with javelin and spear, crashed through the Egyptian ranks like a bronze wave through standing grain. The Ra division shattered. Soldiers broke and ran northward toward the Amun camp, carrying panic with them, Hittite chariots riding among them, killing as they came. The camp dissolved into chaos. Fleeing men poured through the perimeter. Horses screamed, supply wagons overturned. The household guard formed around the pharaoh, but the encirclement was closing. According to the inscriptions Ramesses himself would later commission, the poem of Pentor and the official bulletin carved on temple walls across Egypt, the king found himself nearly alone, abandoned by his officers, surrounded on every side by enemy chariots. The texts record his cry to Amun, a prayer hurled upward from the dust of a collapsing battle, and they claim the god answered. What happened next belongs partly to history and partly to royal propaganda, and the line between them has blurred across 32 centuries. The reliefs show Ramesses on his chariot, his war crown lashed tight, his composite bow drawn, his lion running beside the wheels, charging directly into the Hittite mass. The texts say he made 6 charges. They say he fought alone. They say his arm did not tire. What the evidence does support is that Ramesses counterattacked with extraordinary personal courage at the moment of greatest danger. The Hittite chariots, heavier than Egyptian ones and designed for shock rather than speed, had paused to loot the camp, a catastrophic lapse in discipline. Into that disorder, the pharaoh's lighter, faster chariots struck. And then from the west came salvation. The Nearin, a separate Egyptian force, possibly a garrison from the coast of Amuru, arrived on the battlefield at precisely the critical hour and drove into the Hittite flank. The momentum reversed. Hittite chariot crews were pushed back towards the river. Some drowned in the Orontes. The reliefs at Luxor show the Prince of Aleppo pulled from the water, held upside down to drain his lungs. By evening, the field belonged to neither side. Muwatalli still held Kadesh. His infantry, curiously, had never crossed the river at all, a decision historians still debate. Ramesses held the camp and the plain of the dead, but he had captured nothing. The following day brought no decisive renewal. Both armies faced each other, bloodied and wary. No second great assault came. Eventually Ramesses withdrew southward. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. Amuru slipped back into the Hittite sphere. By any strategic measure, the campaign had failed. Yet the young pharaoh who rode back to Egypt was not the same man who had marched north. He had tasted annihilation and survived it. He had felt the particular loneliness of command when every plan collapses and only the body's own violence remains. The battle had lasted perhaps 3 hours. It would take the rest of his life to tell the story, and he would tell it on every wall he could command, transforming a near catastrophe into the founding myth of his reign. The moment the god within him woke and fought, the afternoon on the Orontes when Ramesses became Ramesses. The stonemasons began before the dust of Kadesh had settled. Within months of the army's return, teams of sculptors were dispatched to every major temple in Egypt and Nubia, carrying detailed sketches approved by the palace, precise compositions showing the moment of divine fury. The pharaoh alone against the horde, his chariot horses rearing as enemies fell beneath bronze wheels. The campaign that had nearly ended in catastrophe would be reborn in limestone and sandstone as the greatest victory Egypt had ever known. The narrative took two literary forms. The first, known today as the Bulletin, was a prose military report, terse, factual in tone, describing the march, the deception by false scouts, the ambush, and the king's personal counterattack. The second was the Poem of Pentor, a longer composition in elevated literary Egyptian, casting Ramesses as the lone hero calling upon Amun in his hour of desperation and receiving divine strength. Both texts were carved together on temple walls, the poem soaring above the reliefs in columns of hieroglyphs, while the bulletin anchored the images below. No pharaoh before him had ever commissioned a single battle narrative on this scale. Ramesses ordered it reproduced at Luxor, at Karnak, at his mortuary temple on the West Bank, at Abydos, and at Abu Simbel, at minimum 5 monumental versions, ensuring that no Egyptian who entered a great temple could avoid the story. The reliefs themselves are masterworks of controlled chaos. At Luxor, the south wall of the Great Court shows the Egyptian camp, its shield wall perimeter, the tethered horses, the officers' court unaware, while Hittite chariots pour across the Orontes in disciplined ranks. Then the composition shifts. Ramesses towers above the scene, his bow drawn, his figure 3 times the size of any enemy, the visual grammar of divine kingship made literal. Dead and dying. Hittites tumble into the river. The message required no literacy to understand. Yet the wars did not end with propaganda. In his 7th regnal year, Ramesses marched again into Canaan, suppressing revolts in Galilee and the Transjordan. In year 8 and 9, he pushed further north, retaking coastal towns in Phoenicia. By year 10, he besieged and captured Dapur, a fortified city in the Amuru region, this time depicted on temple walls with the king himself scaling a siege ladder, shield raised against arrows. These were smaller campaigns, grinding border warfare rather than grand, decisive battles, but they demonstrated continued Egyptian pressure on the Hittite sphere. The stalemate hardened. Neither empire could deliver a killing blow. The Hittites held Kadesh and the interior of Syria. Egypt controlled the coast and Canaan. Between them lay a contested zone where vassal loyalties shifted with each campaign season. The exhaustion was mutual, though neither king would admit it publicly. Meanwhile, the sculptors kept carving. The Kadesh narrative grew with each new temple wall, details subtly shifting. More enemies slain, the divine intervention more explicit, the king's isolation more heroic. Papyrus copies circulated among scribal schools, where students copied the poem of Pentor as a literary exercise for generations. The battle became not merely history but scripture, proof that the gods fought through Pharaoh's body, that Egypt's king was more than mortal. This was Ramesses' genius beyond the battlefield. He understood that memory was architecture, that stone outlasted witnesses, that the story told loudest and longest became the only story. The veterans who knew the terror of that afternoon on the Orontes grew old and died. Their grandchildren knew only the temple walls, the colossal king, the fleeing enemy, the god triumphant. The near disaster dissolved into eternity, replaced by a victory so thoroughly carved into Egypt's sacred landscape that 3,000 years later it remains the most documented military engagement of the ancient world. Not because it was won, but because one man refused to let it be remembered as anything less than divine. But wars, even those carved as eternal victories, eventually exhaust the men who wage them. For 16 years after Kadesh, Egyptian and Hittite armies clashed across Syria in campaigns that consumed treasure, chariots, and lives without shifting the frontier more than a few days' march in either direction. Ramesses took the fortress city of Dapur in his 10th regnal year, besieging its walls with scaling ladders while his sons fought beside him. The reliefs at the Ramesseum preserve the scene. Yet even Dapur could not be held permanently. The Hittites retook it. The Egyptians returned. The cycle ground on, season after season, like millstones wearing each other to dust. Then the world shifted, not on the battlefield, but inside the Hittite court. Muwatalli II died, and after a brief reign by his son, his brother Hattusili seized the throne through what amounted to a palace coup. The new Hittite king faced enemies on every side, a dispossessed nephew who fled east seeking allies, and the rising power of Assyria pressing against Hatti's southeastern flank. Hattusili needed his western border quiet. Ramesses, aging into his 40s, surveying the cost of perpetual campaigning against a foe he could wound but never destroy, recognized the same arithmetic. Two exhausted empires looked across the wreckage of Syria and reached the same conclusion. In Ramesses' 21st regnal year, around 1258 before the Common Era, Hittite messengers arrived in Egypt bearing a silver tablet inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age. The Egyptian version was composed in hieroglyphs. Both texts survive. The Hittite copy discovered in the royal archives at Hattusa in modern Turkey, the Egyptian carved onto the walls of Karnak and the Ramesseum. Together they constitute the oldest known peace treaty between two sovereign powers. A replica hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a testament to its enduring significance. The terms were remarkably modern. Neither kingdom would attack the other. Each would come to the other's defense if invaded by a third power. Political refugees and fugitives would be extradited, though the treaty specified they should not be punished upon return. The gods of both nations were invoked as witnesses, 1,000 deities of Hatti and 1,000 of Egypt, binding heaven itself to the agreement. The silver tablet bore the seal of the Hittite storm god and the image of the Hittite queen embraced by a goddess, details the Egyptian scribes carefully recorded. Ramesses presented the treaty as Hatti suing for peace, the lesser kingdom bowing before Egypt's might. The Hittite version told the opposite story. Both kings claimed magnanimity. Both were, in their way, telling the truth. The peace required neither to kneel, only to stop bleeding. 13 years later, in Ramesses' 34th regnal year, the alliance deepened beyond parchment and silver. A Hittite princess traveled south with an enormous dowry and a military escort through the winter rains of Canaan, arriving at Pi-Ramesses to become Ramesses' bride. The Egyptians named her Nefertari, she who sees the beauty of Ra. The marriage stela at Abu Simbel describes the journey in lavish detail. The princess beautiful beyond description, the foreign soldiers mingling with Egyptian troops, the rain god of Hatti parting the storms so his daughter could travel in fair weather. Ramesses presented it as tribute, a foreign king sending his daughter in submission. But the diplomatic correspondence tells a subtler story. This was alliance, not conquest, sealed in the most personal currency of the ancient world. Pi-Ramesses celebrated. The Delta capital, now approaching its zenith, glittered with faience and gold as the Hittite bride entered its gates. Two empires that had spent a generation trying to destroy each other now shared a royal bed, a diplomatic post road, and a mutual enemy in Assyria. The peace held. For the remaining decades of Ramesses' reign, no Egyptian army marched against Hatti, and no Hittite chariot threatened the Egyptian frontier. Letters between the courts discussed medicine, trade, and family health with a warmth that suggests genuine rapport between the aging kings. The age of war between the two greatest powers of the late Bronze Age was over, ended not by a sword, but by a silver tablet and a princess walking through winter rain toward a kingdom she would never leave. With peace secured, Ramesses turned the full weight of Egypt's resources toward stone. No pharaoh before or after would build on this scale. Not Khufu with his single perfect pyramid, not Amenhotep III with his elegant temples. Ramesses built everywhere, simultaneously for decades, as though the entire Nile Valley were a canvas awaiting his cartouche. The numbers stagger. More than a dozen major temple complexes bore his name. Tens of thousands of laborers quarried granite at Aswan, sandstone at Gebel el-Silsila, limestone from the Tura cliffs. Barges carried blocks weighing hundreds of tons down the river to sites separated by 1,000 kilometers. The administration required to feed, house, and coordinate these workers rivaled the logistics of his military campaigns. And unlike war, the building never stopped. At Abu Simbel, deep in Nubia where the sandstone cliffs meet the river, his engineers carved directly into the living rock. 4 seated colossi of the king, each standing over 20 meters tall, emerged from the cliff face as though the mountain itself had given birth to a god. The interior penetrates 60 meters into the stone, hall after hall, diminishing toward the innermost sanctuary, where 4 seated figures wait in perpetual darkness. Twice each year, around the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October, the rising sun penetrates the entire axis of the temple and illuminates 3 of the 4 statues with golden light. The 4th, Ptah, lord of the underworld, remains in shadow. This was not accident. This was theology expressed in architecture, calculated across decades of observation. Beside the great temple, a smaller one honored Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, the only instance in Egyptian history where a queen's temple stood equal beside her king's at the same site. 6 standing colossi adorned its facade, 4 of Ramesses and 2 of Nefertari, all the same height. The inscription declared that this was the queen for whom the sun rises. 500 kilometers north, on the western bank at Thebes, the Ramesseum rose as his mortuary temple, the house of millions of years where his cult would endure eternally. Its great colossus, carved from a single block of granite weighing over 1,000 tons, once sat enthroned before the first pylon. When it fell, perhaps from earthquake centuries later, its shattered fragments inspired the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus to record the name Ozymandias, a corruption of User Matra, Ramesses' throne name. At Karnak, he completed the vast hypostyle hall begun under his father. 134 columns filling an area large enough to contain a cathedral, the central 12 rising over 20 meters with open papyrus capitals broad enough for 50 men to stand upon. Every surface carried carved relief and painted color. At Luxor, he added a new pylon, a courtyard, and colossal statues that still greet visitors today. But his greatest creation was Pi-Ramesses itself, the House of Ramesses, great of victories. Built over the eastern delta site of Avaris, it sprawled across 18 square kilometers, housing perhaps 300,000 souls at its peak. Excavations reveal floors of faience tiles glazed in turquoise and cobalt, door frames of granite, stables for chariot horses, bronze foundries, and a throne room whose walls blazed with inlaid color. It was the largest city in the world of its time, positioned strategically to command both the Sinai routes and the sea trade of the eastern Mediterranean. He also claimed what others had built. Across Egypt, Ramesses masons recarved the cartouches of predecessors, deepening the hieroglyphs so they could never again be altered. Statues of Amenhotep III received his name. Monuments at Memphis, Heliopolis, and Abydos bore his mark whether he had commissioned them or not. Later generations would know only one builder, Ramesses. The stone endured. 3,000 years of flood, sand, and human plunder could not erase what he commanded into existence. The temples still stand. The colossi still gaze eastward across the Nile. Whatever else history might say of this king, his vanity, his exaggeration, his relentless self-promotion, the monuments speak their own truth. He built for eternity, and eternity against all probability obliged. Behind the colossi and the carved victories, behind the temples rising along the Nile and the treaties sealed in silver, there lived a man who loved. And the evidence of that love survives in the most beautiful tomb ever painted. Her name was Nefertari Meritmut, beautiful companion, beloved of the goddess Mut. She appears at Ramesses' side from the very first year of his sole reign, already bearing the title Great Royal Wife, already mother to his eldest sons. Her origins remain uncertain. Some scholars have traced her lineage to the 18th dynasty court at Thebes, perhaps connected to the family of Ai, though no inscription confirms it. What the record does confirm is her extraordinary prominence. On temple walls at Luxor, she stands nearly equal in scale to the king himself. At Abu Simbel, her smaller temple bears 4 colossal statues of Ramesses, flanking 2 of Nefertari, a gesture without precedent, for no pharaoh had ever granted a queen her own rock-cut temple beside his own. The inscription above the entrance declares that the temple was made so that the sun might shine upon her face forever. She bore Ramesses at least 4 sons and 2 daughters. She served as a diplomatic figure in her own right, corresponding with the Hittite queen Puduhepa in letters preserved in the cuneiform archives at Hattusa. She participated in temple consecrations and jubilee ceremonies, visible and powerful in ways few Egyptian queens had been. Then, around the 24th year of the reign, she vanished from the record. No death inscription survives, no mourning text. She simply ceases to appear, and the silence is its own testimony. She was buried in tomb 66 in the Valley of the Queens, discovered by the Italian archaeologist Ernesto Schiaparelli in 1904. What he found inside has never been surpassed. The walls glow with pigment as vivid as the day it was applied, lapis blue ceilings scattered with golden stars, Nefertari herself rendered in white linen with eyes lined in kohl, guided through the afterlife by Isis and Hathor, her skin luminous against backgrounds of deep turquoise. Every surface breathes with color and devotion. The tomb was not merely decorated. It was consecrated, every image a prayer that she might live eternally among the gods. With Nefertari gone, the second great royal wife, Isetnofret, rose to primary prominence. She had likely held the title simultaneously for years, managing a parallel household, bearing sons who would prove dynastically essential. Her son Kayemwaset became the high priest of Ptah at Memphis and earned a reputation unique among royal princes. He restored crumbling monuments of earlier dynasties, studied ancient texts, and was remembered by later Egyptians as a sage and magician. Her youngest surviving son, Merneptah, would ultimately inherit the throne. Isetnofret herself died before the end of the reign, her burial place still unconfirmed. Beyond these two principal queens, the royal household expanded to staggering proportions. Ramesses fathered over 100 children by wives whose names fill procession lists carved on temple walls at Luxor and the Ramesseum, rows of princes and princesses stretching across entire corridors, each identified by name and title. Some of his own daughters became his wives in later years, a practice documented in royal inscriptions and consistent with the theological fiction that Pharaoh, as a god, operated beyond ordinary human boundaries. Bintanath and Meritamun both bore the title Great Royal Wife after their mothers' deaths. The Hittite princess Mathorn-Ferua arrived around year 34, her marriage sealing the peace between empires. She bore Ramesses at least one daughter and lived in the royal household, though she never achieved the prominence of Nefertari or Isetnofret. This vast family was both Ramesses' pride and his eventual sorrow. The procession lists on temple walls are a census of mortality. Son after son, Amun-Herhepeshef, Ramesses Jr., Pareha-Wenemef, Kayemwaset, would predecease their father, their names eventually crossed by time and silence. The king who built for eternity would outlive nearly every child he had raised, every wife he had cherished. The painted tomb in the Valley of the Queens endures as proof that even a god-king understood loss. He built Nefertari a chamber worthy of heaven itself, and then he lived on without her for nearly 40 years, surrounded by stone faces that could never answer back. Yet the stone faces did answer in their own way. For Ramesses did not merely build temples to the gods. By the middle decades of his reign, he had become one. Not in the metaphorical sense that all pharaohs embodied divine kingship, but in a theological innovation unprecedented in Egyptian history. He commanded that his own living image be worshipped alongside the great gods themselves. Deep within Abu Simbel, beyond the 8 colossal Osiride pillars, beyond the painted chambers depicting Kadesh and divine offerings, the corridor narrows into a final sanctuary carved from the living rock. There, in perpetual darkness broken only twice each year by the rising sun, 4 seated figures wait: Ptah, Amun-Ra, the deified Ramesses, and Ra-Horakhti, The king sits among them as an equal, not a servant, not a supplicant, a god enthroned beside gods. On the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October, dawn light penetrates 65 meters of stone corridor and illuminates 3 of the 4 figures. Ptah, lord of the underworld, remains always in shadow. The engineering required to achieve this solar alignment across such depth speaks to decades of astronomical calculation and theological intent. This was not vanity alone, though vanity played its part. Egyptian theology held that Pharaoh was the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine, the living Horus, son of Ra, the one who maintained Ma'at, cosmic order, through daily ritual. Ramesses extended this doctrine to its logical extreme. If Pharaoh sustained the universe, then Pharaoh was himself divine substance made flesh. Inscriptions at Abu Simbel and throughout Nubia name him explicitly as a god receiving cult offerings from his own priests. The daily temple ritual reinforced this cosmic architecture. Before dawn in every major sanctuary, priests purified themselves in sacred lakes, entered sealed chambers, broke the clay seals on shrine doors, and awakened the divine statue within, washing it, anointing it with oils, clothing it in fresh linen, presenting food and incense. Ramesses' name sanctified these rituals. His cartouche appeared on every lintel, every offering table, every sacred vessel. The temples functioned as machines for sustaining creation, and the king was their engine. In year 30, approximately 1249 before the Common Era, Ramesses celebrated his first Sed festival, the ancient jubilee of royal renewal, traditionally held after 30 years of rule. The ceremony required the king to demonstrate physical vigor, running a ritual course between boundary markers, receiving the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt anew, and being symbolically reborn. For most pharaohs, a single Sed festival sufficed for an entire reign. Ramesses would celebrate at least 14, one every 2 to 3 years after the first, each occasion demanding massive temple preparations, feasting, and processions visible across the kingdom. At Thebes, the great festivals of Opet carried Amun's sacred bark from Karnak to Luxor Temple along a sphinx-lined avenue, the god visiting his southern sanctuary while crowds lined the processional way. Ramesses had expanded Luxor's courtyard specifically to magnify this spectacle, his colossal seated figures flanking the entrance, his obelisks catching the afternoon light. During the beautiful feast of the valley, the divine bark crossed the Nile to visit the mortuary temples on the west bank, and the living mingled with the dead in celebration. These were not mere pageants. They were the mechanism by which Egypt renewed itself, and Ramesses stood at their center as both celebrant and celebrated. The high priests of Amun at Thebes grew powerful during these decades, administering vast temple estates, commanding thousands of workers, controlling granaries that rivaled the state treasury. Ramesses managed this growing ecclesiastical power carefully, appointing loyalists, rotating priesthoods, and ensuring that his own divine cult provided a counterweight to Amun's clergy. The balance held during his lifetime. It would not hold after. Incense rises in columned halls. Sunlight strikes a stone face twice yearly in perfect silence. A king who has reigned for 3 decades declares himself eternal, and for 3,000 years no one has entirely proven him wrong. But eternity exacts its toll in flesh. By the 40th year of his reign, Ramesses had outlived nearly every person who had witnessed his coronation. The viziers who administered his early campaigns were dust. The generals who rode beside him at Kadesh slept in their tombs. And now, with terrible regularity, his own sons began to die. Amun-Hekepeshef, the firstborn, the prince who had ridden in the chariot beside his father as a boy during the Nubian campaigns, gone. Ramesses Jr., once designated heir, gone. One by one, the eldest sons of the king's body preceded him into the western darkness. The processions to the Valley of the Kings became grimly familiar. The canopic jars, the golden masks scaled for princes, the sealed chambers cut deep into limestone. In a tomb now designated KV5, workers carved corridor after corridor, chamber after chamber, the largest sepulchre ever hewn from the Theban hills, with space for more than 50 of the king's sons. Its rediscovery in 1995 revealed a labyrinth of over 120 rooms, many still choked with flood debris, the walls bearing the names and titles of princes who never reigned. Among those lost was Khaemwaset, perhaps the most remarkable of all Ramesses' children. This fourth son had served as high priest of Ptah at Memphis, but his true passion was the past itself. He wandered the pyramid fields of Saqqara and Giza, reading inscriptions already 1,500 years old, restoring monuments of forgotten kings, carving labels identifying their original builders. Later generations remembered him as a sage and magician. He was, in a sense, Egypt's first antiquarian, and he died around the king's 55th regnal year, leaving his aged father to bury yet another heir. Beyond the palace walls, the world was shifting. Along the western delta frontier, Libyan tribes pressed inward with increasing boldness. These were not the disorganized raiders of earlier centuries, but confederations, the Libu, the Meshwesh, driven eastward by drought and hunger, seeking the black soil of the Nile. Fortresses along the desert edge required constant reinforcement. Garrison reports on papyrus speak of patrols, skirmishes, captured cattle, and prisoners branded and settled as laborers. The threat was containable but unrelenting, a slow bleeding of resources that would explode into full invasion under Ramesses' successor. Further north, across the sea, civilizations were beginning to collapse. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's treaty partner, faced internal fractures and pressure from migrating peoples whom Egyptian scribes would later call foreigners of the sea. Trade networks that had connected Cyprus, Ugarit, and the Aegean to the Nile Delta grew unreliable. Diplomatic letters arrived less frequently. The Bronze Age world order, the system of great kings addressing each other as brothers, was fraying at its edges, though no one yet understood the catastrophe approaching. At court, the aging Ramesses presided over ceremonies with a body increasingly betraying him. His spine curved, his teeth worn to the roots by sand-contaminated bread, abscessed painfully, his joints stiffened with arthritis. Yet he endured, performing the rituals, receiving foreign envoys, authorizing construction. The administration functioned through experienced viziers and through Merneptah, the 13th son, now an old man himself past 60, finally designated as crown prince after every elder brother had fallen away. The frontier fortresses stand in amber light, their mud brick walls patched and repatched against the desert wind. Inside the palace at Pi-Ramesses, scribes record the king's 55th jubilee, his 56th. The corridors of KV5 stretched deeper into darkness, waiting for princes not yet dead. And Ramesses endures, not through strength now, but through sheer refusal to relinquish the breath that makes him God. The empire contracts slowly around him like a garment grown too large, and still he sits upon the throne, outliving sons, outliving allies, outliving the very world that made him. The body betrays what the stone will never confess. Sometime around his 80th year, the man who had charged alone into Hittite chariots at Kadesh could no longer walk without pain. Modern examination of the mummy reveals the evidence with clinical precision: severe degenerative arthritis in the hips, hardened arteries, a spine curving forward under the accumulated weight of 9 decades. His jaw, once set in the proud line carved on 100 temple walls, was riddled with dental abscesses so deep they had eroded the bone itself. Infection must have been constant, a low fire burning beneath the divine mask. His teeth, worn to the roots by sand-contaminated bread eaten across a lifetime, could no longer chew solid food. The physicians of Pi-Ramesses would have prepared soft pastes of grain and honey, medicines of willow bark and ground minerals, poultices pressed against swollen gums. None of it could reverse what time had done, yet the rituals continued. The said festival, that ancient ceremony of royal renewal first performed in his 30th regnal year, had been repeated so many times that by the final decade it had lost all precedent. 13 celebrations, then a 14th. No pharaoh in recorded history had claimed so many. Each required the king to appear before the gods and the people, to sit enthroned in the Jubilee Pavilion, to receive the crook and flail anew, to demonstrate that divine vitality still coursed through the royal body. Whether Ramesses could still perform the ritual run between the boundary markers, that symbolic sprint proving physical fitness to rule, remains unknown. The inscriptions record the festivals without admitting frailty. But the court knew. The priests knew. The old king was carried now, borne on a gilded palanquin through temple corridors he had built when his hair was still the copper red that his mummy preserves, when his stride was long and his voice carried across parade grounds. The kingdom he surveyed from that palanquin had changed around him in ways both visible and subtle. Pi-Ramesses still gleamed, its faience-tiled columns catching the delta light, its harbors busy with trade vessels from Cyprus and Byblos. But the administrative papyri from these final years reveal a bureaucracy operating increasingly through its own momentum. Viziers in Upper and Lower Egypt managed the daily governance, tax collection, grain distribution, temple endowments, border security, all flowed through channels that no longer required the king's direct hand. Meneptah, the 13th son, now bore the functional weight of rule. He was himself past 60, grey-haired, patient, a man who had waited longer than most pharaohs ever reigned. He issued orders in his father's name, reviewed military dispatches from the western frontier, where Libyan pressure continued to build, and managed the vast household of a king with scores of surviving children and grandchildren whose claims and rivalries multiplied with every passing year. The scribes of the late reign recorded what they could. Ostraca and papyrus fragments preserve inventories, work schedules for tomb builders, correspondence about grain shipments, the ordinary machinery of a state whose divine center had become an ancient, ailing man. In the temples, Ramesses' cartouche was still carved fresh into new surfaces, his names still spoken in the morning liturgy, when priests broke the seal on the sanctuary door and woke the god within. At Abu Simbel, the sun still penetrated the inner chamber twice each year to illuminate his divine image alongside Amun-Ra, Ptah, and Ra-Horakhti. The stone Ramesses remained eternally young, eternally powerful, eternally seated among the gods. The living Ramesses sat in the palace at Pi-Ramesses as the seasons turned, as the Nile rose and fell, as reports arrived from frontiers he would never visit again. His world had narrowed to the rooms he could reach, the faces of attendants and physicians, the incense smoke rising before household shrines. Outside, the empire he had shaped still held, diminished, pressured, but intact. The treaties he had signed still kept peace with Hatti. The monuments he had raised still proclaimed his name from the cataracts to the sea. But the man inside the legend was disappearing, consumed slowly by the same body that had once been his greatest instrument of power. Each morning the sun rose over the delta, gilding the obelisks and colossi of his capital, and each morning the oldest king Egypt had ever known opened his eyes to a world that had already begun to forget what it was like before him. And then one morning he did not open them. Sometime in the summer of his 67th regnal year, around 1213 before the Common Era, the breath that had sustained the longest reign in Egyptian memory simply ceased. The physicians who had attended him through years of pain, the swollen joints, the abscessed jaw, the spine curved like a bent reed, could do nothing more. Ramesses the Great, User Mat-Ra Setepen-Ra, Lord of the Two Lands, living image of Ra on earth, was dead. He was approximately 90 years old. No pharaoh had ever lived so long. None ever would again. The palace at Pi-Ramesses fell into the ritual silence that protocol demanded. Messengers rode south along the river carrying the news to Thebes, to Memphis, to the garrison towns of Nubia. In every temple, priests began the lamentations. But grief was secondary to urgency, for the body of a god required transformation, and the 70 days had begun. The embalmers received him in their workshop, the place the Egyptians called the Beautiful House. They laid the old king upon a stone table, and the chief lector priest recited the opening prayers. Then the work commenced. A hooked bronze instrument was inserted through the nasal cavity to extract the brain, which the Egyptians considered of no consequence for eternity. The left flank was opened with an obsidian blade, and the viscera drawn out, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines, each to be preserved separately in canopic vessels of alabaster. The heart alone remained within the chest, for it would speak for him before Osiris in the hall of judgment. Natron salt packed the emptied cavity and covered the body entirely, drawing moisture from the flesh over 40 days. The workshop smelled of salt and cedar oil, and the faint sweetness of decay arrested. When the desiccation was complete, the embalmers washed the body, anointed it with resins and unguents, and began the wrapping. Hundreds of meters of fine linen bandages, layer upon layer, with protective amulets placed at prescribed positions. Scarabs over the heart, the Jed pillar at the spine, the Eye of Horus at the throat. Molten resin sealed each layer. The crossed arms were bound against the chest, hands once wrapped around chariot reins, now holding the crook and flail of sovereignty for eternity. The golden coffin received him. The funeral mask, if one existed, for none has survived, would have rendered his face as it had been in youth, strong-jawed, aquiline, eternal. Then the procession began. The funeral barge crossed the Nile from the eastern bank of the living to the western bank of the dead. It moved at sunset, as tradition demanded, the gilded prow catching the last copper light on the water. Behind it followed boats carrying the canopic chest, furniture, shabtis by the hundred, food offerings, weapons, jewelry, everything a king required in the field of reeds. On the western shore, the procession turned south towards the Valley of the Kings, winding through the desert wadis in torchlight, priests chanting, incense billowing in clouds that hung motionless in the still air. Pi-Ramesses waited. Cut deep into the limestone of the valley floor, its corridors descended through decorated chambers painted with scenes from the Book of Gates and the Book of the Dead, the king's passage through the underworld's 12 hours of night. The sarcophagus of red granite stood in the burial chamber. They lowered him in. The rituals of opening the mouth were performed, restoring to the mummy the senses it would need, sight, hearing, speech, so that Ramesses might live again among the gods. Then the tomb was sealed. Stone and plaster closed the corridor. Guards took their positions. The valley returned to silence. At Thebes, and then at Pi-Ramesses, Nefertari, already past 60 himself, white-haired, the 13th son who had never expected the throne, received the double crown. He inherited an empire still vast but strained, its borders tested by Libyans from the west and strange seafaring peoples gathering in the eastern Mediterranean. Within 5 years, he would face invasion on 2 fronts simultaneously. But that was the future. In the present moment, in the sealed darkness of KV7, the body of Ramesses lay in perfect stillness. Above him, carved into every temple wall from the delta to the 4th cataract, his name endured in stone. Thousands of cartouches, tens of thousands, more than any king before or after. The man was gone. The monument remained. But the dynasty did not. Within 2 decades of Ramesses' burial, the 19th dynasty tore itself apart in succession crises, usurpations, and a brief Syrian chancellor's seizure of the throne. By the time the 20th dynasty stabilized Egypt under Ramesses III, the world the great king had known, the Hittite Empire, the Bronze Age trade networks, the balance of powers sealed by his treaty, had collapsed entirely, swept away by famine, migration, and the mysterious sea peoples. His name still covered every temple wall, but the empire he had governed was already contracting towards the Nile. Then the tombs began to fail. Flooding damaged KV7 repeatedly, water pouring through limestone corridors, warping the painted plaster, silting the burial chamber. Worse, tomb robbers worked the Valley of the Kings systematically during the 21st dynasty. Sometime around 950 before the Common Era, priests of Amun gathered the violated royal mummies, Ramesses among them, stripped them of remaining gold, rewrapped their linen, and carried them secretly to a deep shaft tomb cut into the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, known today as TT 320. There, in absolute darkness, 40 royal bodies lay stacked together for nearly 3,000 years. The Greeks came and went. Diodorus Siculus, visiting Thebes in the 1st century before the Common Era, described the mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, and recorded the inscription he read on its largest colossus. "King of kings am I, Ozymandias." The name was a Greek mangling of User Matre, Ramesses' throne name. By then, sand had already buried the lower halves of the statues. The biblical tradition, meanwhile, wove its own thread. Later interpreters placed the Exodus in Ramesses' reign, though no Egyptian source confirms it. The pharaoh became villain and wonder simultaneously, depending on who told the story. In 1818, Percy Bysshe Shelley published 14 lines that would outlast most monuments. His sonnet Ozymandias imagined a shattered colossus in empty desert, its pedestal reading, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The irony was deliberate. Yet Shelley never saw Egypt. The real colossi were not lost. They were waiting. In 1881, the Abd el-Rasul family of Luxor, who had been quietly selling antiquities for years, led authorities to the Deir el-Bahari cache. Inside lay Ramesses II, his linen wrappings marked in hieratic script identifying him by name. Gaston Maspero unwrapped the mummy in 1886. The face that emerged was aquiline, sharp-boned, imperious even in death. The hooked nose, the high cheekbones, wisps of red-gold hair still clinging to the skull. Nearly a century later, in 1976, the mummy traveled to Paris for conservation treatment, issued an Egyptian passport listing his occupation as king, deceased. French scientists treated fungal damage and confirmed his advanced arthritis, dental abscesses, and likely cause of death, circulatory failure in extreme old age. Meanwhile, his greatest monument faced annihilation. The Aswan High Dam, begun in 1960, threatened to drown Abu Simbel beneath Lake Nasser. Between 1964 and 1968, a UNESCO campaign costing $40 million cut the entire temple complex into over 1,000 blocks, each weighing up to 30 tons, and reassembled them 65 meters higher on an artificial cliff. The four colossi rose again above the water, facing east as they always had, catching the dawn. Modern CT scans have mapped every fracture and cavity in the royal body. DNA studies have confirmed his lineage. His face has been digitally reconstructed, a strong-jawed man with a prominent nose, recognizably the same face carved into sandstone at Abu Simbel 32 centuries ago. He outlasted the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans. He outlasted the language that spoke his name and the religion that called him divine. His cartouche remains the most reproduced royal name in human history, not because he was the wisest or the most just, but because he understood something no other pharaoh grasped so completely, that stone remembers what flesh forgets, and that a name carved deeply enough becomes indistinguishable from eternity itself. Thank you for joining this journey through the life and legend of Ramesses the Great. If these stories brought the ancient world closer, consider subscribing so you never miss the next chapter of history brought to life.